Okay, welcome to another episode of Least Worst Practices, the webinar where I chat to Atlassian greats and legends like Brad Quirk, who we're going to meet, and we declare that there are no best practices, but there are things that are often good to try with teams, and you should maybe try them too. Brad, what's the first topic that you'd like to explore and why?
Yeah, cool. And thanks for having me, Kit, by the way. I guess the three topics that we'll cover today are Cynefin management, the Cynefin framework rather. So how to correctly navigate the world and the system that you live in based on the context of the problems that you reside in. And off the back of that, worst best practice, however you want to frame it, is really based around how we shouldn't be demonizing traditional waterfall methods when they might actually be the way to go in certain environments. I can also talk about some of the experimentation that I've done in the marketplace, which kind of dovetails off the back of a lot of what is underpinned by Cynefin. And now that I run my own development team, we can talk about option management as well and how that can be an important step towards autonomy for a lot of larger organizations out there.
Awesome, sounds good. And Cynefin's a bit of an interesting one, right? Being from the UK, I've seen the videos where David Snowden talks about it and everyone gets confused around the spelling. But like, what is this thing that no one can pronounce until they see David Snowden talk about it in a video? And like, have you found it useful in the Atlassian and Agile space?
Yeah, 100%. So anyone who isn't familiar with Cynefin, exactly, you're spot on, mate. The actual spelling and even some of the interpretation of the framework can be a bit of a challenge due to the alliteration, but I think it's really important nonetheless. And the reason why I bring this up is, like for context, it's a sense-making framework that was developed by a gentleman named Dave Snowden in the late 90s. And over time, it's become a topic that kind of has become more and more ingrained in the Agile space and everything that kind of spins off the back of that. Without going into the full nuts and bolts of it, really the focus for many organizations is on the top two quadrants. So what resides in the complex domain and what resides in the complicated domain. The main differentiation, I guess, is that in the complicated space, what is deemed as best practice is something that can actually be considered a solvable equation. So once you figure out what the rules of the system are, they're repeatable. Your experimentation is fairly limited. Once you actually know what to do, it's quite repeatable after that. Things in the complex space are quite different. What makes sense today might not necessarily make sense tomorrow. I don't know about you, Kit, but I'm actually a big pro wrestling nerd, a bit of a guilty pleasure of mine. And quick aside, there's a famous quote by Rowdy Roddy Piper, who was doing a segment on a wrestling show one day, and he was interviewing some, admittedly some no-name bloke who he was really kind of getting into his face about the whole thing. And long story short, being a pro wrestling environment, there was an altercation, and at the end of it, Piper said, when you come up with the answers, I go ahead and change the questions. And I think that kind of encapsulates a lot of what happens in the complex space is the questions keep changing, especially when there are people involved. More and more in the modern market, we kind of find ourselves in the complex space. And it's really important because especially whether it's the Atlassian marketplace, whether it's, practically anywhere that, again, even in the B2B realm, there are still people involved. A lot of what happens is complex, changing components in the Atlassian tool set itself, new products that are emerging on the market. Again, what worked today might not necessarily work tomorrow. So it's really important for any budding entrepreneur or even existing marketplace vendor or anyone in the Atlassian space in general is you should be constantly running experiments to validate what your assumptions are and validate that there are still customer needs that you thought existed yesterday that may persist through to tomorrow. Similarly, there's the complicated realm where there are certain things that, like I said before, for all intents and purposes, fairly solvable and fairly discrete and constant throughout the world. It's more of like, your death taxes and whatever your third favorite comparison is, really is anything that works in that space is typically more, in my experience, it's a lot more like physical in nature or a lot more tangible. with what you're trying to produce as a product or a service. So a great example from my coaching background is working with a lot of data center teams in large banks, trying to peddle an agile philosophy or anything that would exist in complex space for them wouldn't really cut the mustard. Like there's no real reason to experiment with the way that you're going to build a data center when you already have the spec sheet, exactly what it is that you're going to build. So it's interesting because the summary and the practice here is quite often what people assume is a complicated problem actually resides in complex space. And a lot of coaches have found themselves in the trap of thinking that everything is a complex problem when actually that might not necessarily be the case.
Yeah, I think you're bang on. And I always talk with teams about how, like, I'm not saying waterfall's not appropriate. Waterfall's great in some spaces. My favorite
Yeah,
example was a friend, Matt Meckers, and he used to always work in digital advertising work. And they waterfalled most of their projects, right? They were little 6-week pieces where you developed something. And actually, you could fix things with that constraining timeline. So the fact that it was a jazzy, exciting, creative space didn't mean that you couldn't be fixing constraints and doing things. Whereas, especially in large organizations, I see a lot of people say, hey, I've fixed the scope, therefore I should go down this route. I'm like, you haven't fixed anything. Like, that's it. All you got
that's it. It's
is
all
like one
artificial.
of these 3 other areas. And like, you kind of don't even know which until you open the kind of worms and unpack things.
Exactly right, Matt. Exactly right. So yeah, that's like I think for years misunderstood the practical application of Cynefin. I just thought it was a neat little, almost like a gimmick in a sense, where I was, oh great, I'm in the complex space. Now what? Kind of thing was kind of where I was left scratching my head. But more and more as you navigate these hybrid environments or hybrid sort of problem sets where yeah, you can sort of separate the concerns to an extent. There is quite a lot to be said for, really being critical of where you reside at any point in time.
It reminds me, actually, I speak a lot with people about a sort of cycle of configuration approaches, especially with Atlassian tooling, but arguably with all tooling. And like, everyone that I've seen always has this idea of like some sort of golden config pattern or schemas
Oh
where they'll
yeah,
define this like amazing kind of set of workflows and things. And I get the aspiration, but in my experience, you've got to have that cycle where you try and put something out there, but then you expect and kind of embrace teams wanting to add their own nuances. And then yes, it gets too messy, and then you need a bit of a tidy up. And but it's interesting seeing this in front of us. I sort of feel like you can often cycle through those spaces as your teams,
yeah.
organizations, as your tooling kind of matures. And like, you might need to start off treating things like they're in a chaotic place where you just don't know how your 50 teams are using things. And then you want
Mm,
to move it into a complex or a complicated realm to help codify things a bit more without pretending that it's actually clear, because it's not clear.
100%. Yeah, and I'd say in the Atlassian space, that's even more relevant in recent years now that a lot of new products are coming out onto the market. Like I'll fully admit I was definitely guilty of that sort of golden workflow type of approach where you walk into any sort of agile enterprise shop and you want to sort of connect your portfolio to the actual execution of work. Well, you kind of need like a 3 to 4 tier system, and this is sort of like the what's worked elsewhere, and you largely are just going through the motion because you know if you didn't have a Jira Align, if you didn't have a Jira Product Discovery, that was just kind of the approach. At best case, it was a starting point. Worst case, everything got locked down and there was no chance to iterate. But yeah, especially now that, there's Atlas and Jira Product Discovery and all these DevOps tools and Jira Align as well keeps evolving. Like there's just so many different parts that, especially in a large organization, how they actually choose to apply those means that, yeah, practically everything is in the complex space. And if you ask a lot of individuals, a bit chaotic as well.
Love it, love it. And I feel this kind of naturally bleeds into your other topics that we had, right? And like, maybe it's a good time to
Yeah.
like ask, what exactly does Quirk do other than be your second name and a fun thing to combine with my second name? But like, what do you make?
Yeah, good question, mate. So a bit of background about me real quick is kind of like I alluded to, I have an agile coaching background, and that was really my staple for the better part of 10 years. Long story short, I didn't know how to code until quite recent in my career. It was really like a a COVID type of venture for me. It was either you make sourdough or learn how to do something that's probably. I continually found myself dealing with a lot of these problems that were quite common threads in many different organizations. And because the actual, at least from a tooling perspective, especially in the Atlassian space, 4 to 5 years ago, really had to come up with something yourself if you couldn't find something off the shelf. And it was still quite an emerging marketplace back then as well. So when the pandemic hit and I found myself a little bit more time on my hands, I thought, you know what? Let's actually have a crack at this whole app development thing. At the very least, if it all goes belly up, then I can take those learnings back into my coaching space and have a better connection with the teams that I work with. But lo and behold, at least one of my apps took off, and now it's become a key part of my business. So I do run my own team now, then we do develop apps for the Atlassian marketplace, and we're trying to emerge in other marketplaces as well. So that's really my background and kind of what I do is I kind of straddle the world between product and service these days as a company. But yeah, in terms of the second topic and around experimentation, that does really take us to at least what I think is a very interesting picture, which is the live public vendor space for my company, Quirk, which I think tells quite a compelling story. When I was learning to develop and release apps on the marketplace, I decided to run 3 experiments simultaneously, which is actually considered pretty good practice from a Cynefin perspective. You want to do rapid experimentation, you want to run multiple experiments, and you want to make sure you're doing them concurrently. You don't want to do them one at a time because human bias will tell you to just pick the first one and just move on from that. So trying to avoid that sunk cost element of it, I did a bit of a shotgun blast, released 3 different apps, one based on dependency management, one based on scaled backlog visualization, and another that was meant to be a tool that helped Scrum Masters in a lot of their day-to-day reporting and ceremony management. And lo and behold, you can kind of see the installation numbers at the bottom here.
It's really stark, isn't it? It's like...
Yeah. The dependency manager took off, and it was ironically the experiment that I spent the least amount of time on. So it was definitely a lesson learned for me. You can see I kind of put all my eggs in that basket. But again, going back to Cynefin good practice, or least worst practice, I guess, is the whole notion of a weak signal detection. So being able to anticipate market trends before they actually start to flourish and emerge. I figured rather than, recouping my losses and throwing away those 2 apps that weren't so successful and focusing all my attention on the first one, I was still going to put all my effort into where the attraction was and the dependency mapper, but I've left these 2 other apps available in the marketplace just for the sake of research and learning to see, is there any appeal? Is there any spike in activity when I make certain changes? So it's really trying to minimize, I guess, in a sense, the distance to the customer to get some actual unbiased feedback for these other options. And off the back of that, I've actually re-released a lot of the functionality in those 2 spaces. Again, trying to keep it fairly light on in terms of effort, but just trying to bash something together, throw it out there. Do I actually catch a lead? Maybe not. Pull it back in, try again, pull it back in, try again. So getting that system to repeat itself. What's interesting is the most recent development is you can actually see I've got a fairly bad review on my apps, which I think is fantastic. And this is the thing, is I've actually had a bit of a constructive argument with my sales and marketing team around whether we actually keep this on the marketplace or not. But to me, that's like, from a product perspective, that's fantastic validation that there was a need that drew a potential customer to this app that wasn't being served. So it has been my imperative to try and engage with that, whether it's the individual customer or whether it's like an actual segment that we can identify and figure out, well, what's the gap in the market? What's the job that you need this to have to do for you? So that's why I'm trying to prolong the pain of having my ego beaten into submission by having a 1-star review on one of my apps. But I see the good outweighing the bad in that equation for sure.
I can feel your kind of agilist pain going, I must maintain transparency. This 1 star is meaningful versus your marketing team going like, why would you do this to us? What do you
Yeah,
told us
that's
to try and
it.
promote the goodness.
We can't use this.
Oh, I love it. I love it.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess like the least worst practice is to just swallow your pride and keep putting experiments out there. Like bad feedback is still good feedback in many respects, as long as you can curate that conversation in a way where it is constructive. There really is no bad return on investment in that. So rest assured, I'm going to release that Scrum Master Assistant app, and hopefully it'll be better the next time around. But until then, we just wear it.
Yeah, I imagine re-releasing it in the Age of Rover will give you some interesting things to hook onto as well, right? That you maybe didn't have at the beginning.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And that's exactly it. So like to jump on that, like the fact that we are embracing new technologies and there's new products out on the market, both from an Atlassian perspective and, externally from that, like that's the thing is as each year progresses, you may have new options under your belt that you can experiment with. So yeah, there's always something to be said for persisting with a particular problem, even if you can't solve it 100% at that point in time.
Awesome stuff. Thank you so much. It's really interesting to see that in action.
Yeah.
Cool.
And I guess,
I know you
we
get your
talk
third
about the
topic,
final
right?
topic. Yeah. So I guess this one I didn't really have anything visual prepared for, so it's just going to be our two hands themselves. But I guess the final part of that story is I have recently scaled my product side to the point where I have been able to formalize an actual team of developers to scale my efforts and build more fantastic things than I could ever dream of with my hacky two hands. And it's been a really interesting journey in the sense that as a founder and as the leader of this team and someone who has 100% skin in the game, I brought these smart, capable humans into my space, and I have to make sure that they're working on things that are valuable, and B, making sure that they are happy doing those things. Two really complex things to balance, and a lot of organizations don't really get that right. And I guess the learning there is really around the concept of autonomy, which is something that, especially 10 odd years ago when Agile was really in its kind of boom period, autonomy was really the thing that was pushed to the forefront as like this big paradigm shift around, giving power to the people and letting people self-organize. And Kit, I don't know about you, mate, but in a lot of the environments where we try to preach that message, it was really rebuffed tenfold, because the concept of having 100, 200 plus people in a room, creating their own teams, managing their own backlog of work, managing the initiatives that they were delivering was too big of a pill to swallow for various reasons. And I think there's a lot to be said around recognizing that autonomy as a spectrum rather than just a binary, you're either autonomous or you're not. And as I start to scale up my team's operations and I'm getting them on board and familiar with the space and familiar with how we work, the concept of option management has really allowed us to accelerate and kind of find that middle ground between me dictating, okay, here's exactly the thing I want you to build next, versus here's all the tools in the sandpit, go figure out what you want to build next, which can be overwhelming to a lot of people. Like that's another part of it as well. Not everyone wants autonomy, which is always another awkward conversation to have. So the middle ground that we're kind of striking up, again, as we try to shift further and further into that autonomous space, when people do feel comfortable to be that empowered with what they do day to day, is simply giving them a variety of options on what problem to solve. Which sounds really simplistic in nature, but it's actually quite powerful because it has a lot of intangible benefits backing it. Again, thinking of that shift from 0 to 100% autonomous, a lot of it does kind of tend to focus on the solution being pushed up front as something that's ironclad and locked in. And as you go through that whole spectrum, that idea of force feeding the solution dies down, and the idea of focusing on the problem really ramps up to the point where, again, the teams are kind of identifying and solving their own problems internally. So there's no real external prioritization mechanism. But because we're not there yet, but at least I do know the problems that need to be solved, at least from an experimentation perspective. I make sure that I give these incredibly smart, talented, way better than I am humans at least 3 options on what valuable thing they can work on next, with the idea that as long as they're solving one of those 3, 4, 5, then it's something that's going to produce an ROI for myself. At least that's the intent. They have the optionality to make sure they're working on something that furthers their own career, which is a big problem that a lot of teams find themselves in, not just in the Atlassian space, but in general, is they're working on the same solutions or the same problems day in, day out, and there's no advancement there. So giving not a fully extended leash, but at least enough of a middle ground in there to say like, hey, as long as you're kind of operating in this space, like we're on the money. And then over time, we can look to further relax that more and more as they become more tuned into the needs of our customers, which again is something that you can't just flick a switch on overnight.
The retractable dog leash of product management is the least worst practice. Thanks. I like it.
My team's going to love that analogy.
They're like, wow.
I think there's a lot to be said for that.
When we're not there to hear what he's talking about. What kind of options?
I'm going to love when you snip that out of context.
Yeah, I'll just snip that. That's the clip that we'll put on YouTube around things. And I'm really
Exactly
interested,
right.
like practically, what kind of option do you have, like a set you might give? And my follow-up to it be like, what if option 4 is fixing the horrible bug that no one wants to do? Like, how do you make sure that you still do the boring but necessary ones when there's the shiny AI kind of more interesting JavaScript?
Yeah, definitely. Like there is definitely that aspect to it. Like it really is incumbent on having a really rock solid, tangible value model that you can kind of share with your team and you can actually refine and iterate on. So obviously, unless you're in a not-for-profit, like the primary driver for most teams is building new business and getting revenue in. But there are a lot of other factors to value beyond that as well. So whether it is optimizing your code base, whether it is doing something that may delight a user but is really difficult of a problem for us to solve, or whatever else. Like there's a lot of compliance things that we have to do in the background as well, which aren't as sexy, but nonetheless, vital for us to continue our business operations. As long as you can articulate why something is incredibly valuable, 9 times out of 10, that will land with the other person that you're dealing with. If you just tell them, do this thing, if they have even ounce of doubt in their minds, like that's just going to take over. Like, why am I bothering this? I have no idea why it's valuable. That means they can't influence the outcome and they just disassociate themselves from the process, which from a culture perspective is a killer. So again, like that's one of the intangibles of option management is by giving people the flexibility to choose what problems they solve, you've got a higher chance that they'll be hitting their professional development, whether it's internal or otherwise. And teams are more engaged and happier as a result. So it's win-win for everyone. But it does mean that you have to put a little bit more effort in to have those options in place and curated to a level where they can be played at any time.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for your time and insight, Brad. I quite love that. I see this series we can start with people like sharing Jira workflow tips. It's got quite philosophical quite quickly with people. And, that's kind of cool. This is Agile in action, right? We'll put a link to your marketplace page down below, somewhere in the video, and we do things afterwards. Is there anywhere else that people should, somewhere up, down, sideways, anywhere else that people should look to get more pearls of Quirk wisdom?
Yeah, I guess I'll definitely check out our apps on the marketplace. If you have any ideas for, or if you have any particular pain points that need solving, definitely strike up a chat with me. Otherwise, just get in contact. So visit our website, quirk.com.au. Even if it's just a virtual coffee, always up to have a chat about how we can solve other people's problems in their respective organizations.
Great. Thanks so much for your time, Brad. We'll see you soon, I'm sure.
Thanks, kid.